Hello, everyone, and welcome to your next installment of Music Appreciation Online, the online edition. Hope you all have had a good week. This particular lecture is going to cover chapters 43 and 46 out of the textbook. Um, both these chapters have to do with Paris in the modernist era, and they kind of stretch from the 1870s all the way through the 1920s and really just the 1920s. Paris is the first place where modernism really happens. It was one of the first places to rebel against Romanticism, which was seen as kind of a German trait. Um, the French have a long history of wanting to oppose the Germans. And this is an example of that. This picture that you see really has nothing to do with our topic today, but these are a bunch of French World War I soldiers holding a tattered French flag. The only thing it has to do with is just the fact that it's French people from that point in time. One of the first movements in Paris, specifically, that rebelled against Romanticism is a movement called Impressionism. And people confuse Impressionism a lot. In fact, so much so that the textbook is wrong on this movement and then the other movement that we're going to talk about, Symbolism. So what is Impressionism? I've got a simple definition here. This is straight out of Wikipedia. It says, Impressionism is a 19th century art movement characterized by relatively small, thin, yet visible brushstrokes. First thing to notice here, it's an art movement, meaning that it is visual art. Only visual art. The book says that the music we're going to talk about in this chapter is impressionistic. That is impossible because this is a visual art movement and music cannot be seen. Anyway, so you have these visible brushstrokes. It says, let's skip through here, ordinary subject matter, and it has to do with the depiction of light, as it says in the third line, on different objects. So if we look at the first impressionistic painting, that's this one. This is called Impressionist Sunrise, and it is painted by Claude Monet. The date at the bottom says 1872. And I showed this particular painting in a previous lecture, but what you can see here is the sun rising, and it's over water. There's clearly a bunch of fog here because we don't really know exactly what's in the background. We can imagine. We know that there's something that looks like a boat and probably another boat and maybe even a third boat. We know that's probably sun. We know that there's water. That's about it. And you can see the brushstrokes here, just like it said in the definition. Broad, visible brushstrokes. And it shows light. Light as it moves through the fog and bounces off the water. That's what Impressionism is. It's the impression that your eyes have on that type of light. Now, Impressionism is typically confused with the next movement that was out of Paris. And part of the reason being is because I think, the Impressionist painters and the Symbolism is the movement, the Symbolist writers hung out together. They would hang out in places called salons, and we think of salons as a place where you get your hair done. Salons were really a place where ideas were shared, typically over an afternoon tea or glass of wine. So Symbolism is a literary movement. Quick pause. Your first code word is symbol. Symbol. Let's keep going. So what is Symbolism? Here's straight out of Wikipedia. Symbolism was largely a reaction against naturalism and realism, meaning that it's not very natural and not very real. Anti-idealistic styles, which were attempts to represent reality in its gritty particularity and to elevate the humble and the ordinary over the ideal. Symbolism was a reaction in favor of spirituality, the imagination, and dreams. It's very heavy on imagination and dreams. The second part of this definition really, really does a good job of saying what symbolism is. Remember, this is a literary movement. This is writers. Symbolists believe that art should represent absolute truths that could only be described indirectly, that's an odd sentence. Essentially what they're saying is that symbolist writers would present ideas without actually directly saying what those ideas are. They would hint at them. That's the idea of symbols. Provide a bunch of symbols that would hint at it. Thus, they wrote in a very metaphorical and suggestive manner. They just suggested things. They wouldn't outright say what they actually were talking about. Endowing particular images or objects with symbolic meaning. They would absolutely do a lot with images in your head. So a typical symbolist writer would be presenting an idea to you. They wouldn't actually say what the idea is. They would just hint at it. And they would do things to really put a lot of images or pictures in your head. That's what symbolism is in the literary movement. The biggest literary influence for the symbolists is one of the most famous American writers, Edgar Allan Poe. Poe is an interesting guy if you've read any Poe. His stuff is pretty dark. It's usually about death or people going psychotic or tragedy. And I want to look at a quick Poe poem. This is just the first two stanzas from his poem, The Raven. And The Raven is about an elderly man who's sitting alone in his house. His his deep loved wife, we presume, Lenore, is now dead. And he is grieving the fact that she has recently died. A raven comes in and starts to antagonize the man, and he slowly loses his mind. So that's what it's about. Now, let's go through the first couple stanzas. I want you to listen to it. Poe is actually meant to be listened to rather than read. It's much more effective that way. I want you to listen to the rhyme scheme and listen for words that put images in your head, because Poe is excellent at that. So here it is.
Once upon a midnight dreary, while I pondered, weak and weary, o'er many a quaint and curious volume of forgotten lore, while I nodded, nearly napping, suddenly there came a tapping as of someone gently rapping at my chamber door. "'Tis some visitor," I muttered, "tapping at my chamber door, only this and nothing more." Distinctly I remember, it was in the bleak December, and each separate dying ember wrought its ghost upon the floor. Eagerly I wished the morrow. Vainly I had sought to borrow from my books surcease of sorrow, for the lost Lenore, for the rare and radiant maiden whom the angels name Lenore, nameless here forevermore.
So anyway, I'm gonna go back to the poem real quick. I'll put the recording of that online for you because it's excellent. By the way, I can't remember whether I said the first code word. The first code word is symbol. If you missed it, here it is again. First code word is symbol. So the rhyme scheme, if you look at the first stanza, you have in the first line dreary and weary. If you look at the third line and fourth line, you have in the middle napping and then tapping and then rapping. And then the end of the second line, the fourth line, the fifth line, and the sixth line, you have stuff that rhymes with the name Lenore, his long lost Lenore. Lore, door, more. So anyway, it's just fantastic writing. And you can check that out on your own if you'd like. Let's go to... so Poe is actually not a symbolist. He's just who the symbolists were inspired by. Here's an actual symbolist. This is a guy named Stéphane Mallarmé. Mallarmé wrote a really famous poem called The Afternoon of a Faun. Here it is. This is translated from French. It says, let's see, or if those women you note reflect your fabulous senses' desire. Fawn, illusion escapes from the blue eye, cold like a fount of tears, of the most chaste. But the other, she, all sighs, contrasts, you say, like a breeze of day warm on your fleece? No. Through the swoon, heavy and motionless, stifling with heat, the cool morning struggles no water. But that which my flute pours, murmurs to the groves sprinkled with melodies, and the soul breathes out of the twin pipes, quick to breathe before it scatters the sound in an arid rain, is unstirred by any wrinkle of the horizon, the visible breath, artificial and serene, of inspiration returning to heights unseen. Now, if you're looking at this and you're going, I have no idea what that's talking about. That's actually kind of the point. That's what symbolists were after. They wanted to create something that put a lot of pictures in your head, hinted at ideas, but you left it kind of wondering, what the heck did I just read? What were they even trying to say? So in that sense, it can be a little unfulfilling to read symbolism. But this was profoundly influential upon the leading Paris musicians. And so not only is symbolism a literary movement, but it's also a musical movement, because just like in books, music can put images in your head and it can hint at ideas. It's really the same process. So let's look at symbolism in music. And again, the textbook says this is Impressionism. The textbook is wrong. It is just flat out wrong. This is symbolism in music. That's what we should call it. Okay, so how does symbolism happen? What's different about symbolist music as compared to the music that we've studied so far? The first thing is the use of scales. So let's look at a couple of traditional scales. These are the ones that are not really preferred by the symbolist. The first line, is just a major scale. It's a C major scale. And then the second line is a C minor scale. The symbolist preferred to get away from those and use things that had a little bit more color. These are scales that are rather exotic by nature. And so here's one. This is a whole tone scale. Now, this is not something that we would ever study in class. This is like advanced music theory type stuff. But I want you to listen to it. I'm going to play a little recording. It's going to have first the major scale, second the minor scale, and then third the whole tone scale. And listen to the difference of the whole tone scale. So that was major. Next is minor. And now the whole tone scale. So the effect that whole tone scales have on music is that it creates something that kind of floats in space, doesn't really have any sort of direction to it. It's just a different color. Here's another way that symbolism in music is created. First of all, well, it's in chords. Here are some traditional chords. We have studied 3 out of 4 of these. The first one is a major triad. The third chord is a minor triad. The fourth chord is a diminished triad. Those are the 3 that are really popular in music. We did study augmented triads, but to be totally honest, you don't see many augmented triads in music. The second one is a 7th chord. This is a pretty common sound in music. We didn't quite get to it this year, but that's a 7th chord. So these are traditional chords. The symbolists like to use what we call tall chords. This is kind of slang for it. Extended chords. The first one is a type of 7th chord, but it's got a chromatic note in there. The second one is another 7th chord. The third chord, look how many notes are in that. There's 5 notes there. That's a 9th chord. The fourth chord is an 11th chord. It's got, 6 notes there? The 5th chord there is a real open chord. That's a quintal chord. It's built on intervals of 7 half steps. And then the last one is a quartal chord built on intervals of 4 half steps. So we're going to play a recording of these chords. It'll start with the traditional chords. So here those are: major, 7th, minor, diminished. Here are the tall chords. So they're just really creative and different sounds. And they have a really interesting effect on the music. Kind of causes it to float in space where it doesn't really move. The composer that led the symbolist movement is a guy named Claude Debussy. I love Debussy's music. Here's a picture of Debussy. You can see that he lived late 1800s, just into the 1900s. Died just after World War I ended. Here's an example of some Debussy music. This is his Arabesque number 1. This is actually played at my wedding. I love this piece. So anyway, that's a little Debussy. Just gorgeous music. If you notice that the music just kind of floats in space. A little bit about Debussy. He born in Paris, raised in Paris, went to the Paris Conservatory. He was a really big opponent to Wagner's music. He wanted to create something that was completely different. Wagner was so in vogue, and Debussy said, I want to do my own thing. Something that has less tension in it and more just free-flowing beauty in it. And I think he did that. Anyway, you can read the rest of the Debussy biography in the textbook. Let's move on. So that was the late 1800s. Now we're going to go into the early 1900s in Paris. And we have, excuse me, a ballet company that becomes unbelievably important. That is your second code word, is ballet. This is pronounced Ballet Russe. And I've seen several different spellings of this, so it's hard to know what's true. This is the one that's in the textbook, and then I'm going to show a sign here that takes out some of the S's. I don't know which one's right. I'm not a French person, but the Ballet Russe was started by a businessman named Sergei Diaghilev. And here is a picture of Diaghilev. Diaghilev wanted to bring Russian culture to France, which was very popular at the time. This is if you remember, we've talked about how there's this weird relationship between the Russians and the French. They just loved each other. And so this was an example of that culture being brought into Paris, Russian culture. And they wanted to bring in the great Russian composers to write ballets for the Ballet Russe. So anyway, we have a few important people with the Ballet Russe. First one is Sergei Diaghilev. He's the guy in charge, the businessman. The second one is a guy named Vaslav Nijinsky. Here's a picture of Nijinsky. He was one of the most important choreographers for the Ballet Russe. Very controversial choreographer. We're actually going to look at a couple of his ballets the next time that we meet over Zoom. And so anyway, Nijinsky's big thing is he wanted to bring modernism to ballet. He wanted to rid the world of the traditional Tchaikovsky Nutcracker style ballet with pointy toe shoes and bring in a new art form. The third name associated with the Ballet Russe is a guy named Igor Stravinsky. Stravinsky is the number one most important composer of the 20th century. Period. He's a big deal. He is on par with a Wagner or a Beethoven. Everyone after Stravinsky will say they were inspired by Stravinsky. And we'll show what's different about Stravinsky when we meet on the Zoom class. He's born in Russia. I think it was St. Petersburg, but that can be looked up. Moves to Paris, writes for the Ballet Russe, eventually leaves there, ends his career in Los Angeles. And so he moves all over the place. His early style writing is for the ballet. We call it his Russian period. And he wrote 3 really huge ballets for the Ballet Russe. The first one was called The Firebird, and it was written about Russian folklore of a firebird and let's see, there's a princess and an evil sorcerer, and the firebird turns into a prince, and that type of thing. Great music. You don't see the ballet done very often anymore, but you hear the music all the time. The second one was, if I didn't say the second code word, it's ballet, by the way. So the first one was symbol, second one is ballet. The second ballet that Igor Stravinsky did was called Petrushka. And in a second, I'm going to show you some images. Well, actually, the original choreography from Petrushka. It's a very fascinating ballet. It is about a sad clown named Petrushka. This sad clown figure shows up in a lot of stories throughout the 20th century. Pagliacci out of Italy. All of the mimes from Paris. If you ever study pantomime, that's a clown look, a sad clown. This is Petrushka out of Russia. You have Pierrot out of France. We're going to look at another Pierrot piece in a week or two. Well, this is a popular character that keeps showing up. So Petrushka is a puppet. That is your third code word. Puppet. Symbol, ballet, puppet. And the ballet begins in a town scene, and they're having a fair, and people are bustling all around the fair and seeing all the sights, and then all of a sudden they come to a magician, and the magician has a puppet show, and the puppets come to life and start dancing, and then all of a sudden the puppets come off their strings and they're dancing among the people. And so the whole theme of the ballet is are these puppets real, or are they really just puppets? So here's a little bit of from Petrushka. And again, this is the original choreography from the Ballet Russe, recreated. Okay, I'm going to skip ahead a little bit because I want to show you the Puppet Master and the Puppet Show. Let's see, where is it? Two guys going to fight. There he is. There's the Puppet Master. He plays a flute. He dazzles people. And then all of a sudden, the Puppet Show. Magician is seen as kind of like a menace to society. He's paying off the police. There's Petrushka, the Moor, the ballerina, and then there's Petrushka. Here they are. So anyway, this is a little bit more traditional ballet choreography than some of the others. The third ballet that Stravinsky wrote is called The Rite of Spring, and that is the most important piece of music in the 20th century, period. And we're going to look at original choreography for this on our Zoom session. The Rite of Spring was so controversial in its premiere at the Ballet Russe that it actually created a riot. And I'm excited for you all to see it. I want to see if you can figure out why there was possibly a riot at the opening for the Rite of Spring. So anyway, that's all I've got. Hope you all enjoyed it. Fill out the code words on the Google form, and I will see you all in a Zoom session coming up soon.